So one thing I've been thinking about a lot recently is systems and mechanics, and I'll explain sort of what they mean to me first. So a system is kind of an ongoing process. It's kind of a rule of the world. So easy example of this from how I see it would be a system is gravity. So gravity affects a lot of things. For example, in a game like bullets, a mechanic would be, firing bullets. So you can shoot a rifle, and a system such as one of the systems, such as gravity, will make that eventually fall. Or not necessarily. A lot of games will actually have shooting systems that are less, or I should say, physics calculations that are less advanced for bullets because it makes aiming a little bit more difficult and harder to predict when they don't actually go straight through your crosshairs, which is of course realistic, but a lot of games choose not to. Anyways, so in that case, a more like all the time would be maybe player gravity. So a mechanic would be jumping, and a system would be gravity returning them to the earth, which in most cases is not really a feature that the player activates. It's just something that's always happening. Or like if you ran off a ledge, you would start falling. Would be a system. So one of the difficult parts of Forbidden Technique as a game that I'm working on is that there are a lot of really exciting systems to me. The system of conversation dynamics by trying to make it not a one dialogue equals one reply, but one dialogue plays a small role, like maybe like 25% of the sway in a miniature system. So the system would be the AI's kind of calculation in the moment based on a bunch of factors that leads to the reply. So that's a really fun system. The mechanic is, okay, you can choose one out of up to 8 different tone options for anything you say. There wouldn't always be 8 options, but up to that many is what I'm saying for now. I could uncap it to be infinite, but for right now it's out of 8. So you could choose 8 different tones for saying the same thing for any of the options you have to say. And the system is, okay, we're going to take that tone into account with a bunch of other factors, and then the AI will decide from all the options available to her, once again up to 8, and then you're going to have to deal with the ramifications of that. So the system is almost kind of a temptation for a lot of developers, I know, because a system is consistent and reliable, and it feels like you're really creating something, its own sort of life system. It kind of self-monitors, and there's a lot of really fun, enjoyable aspects for designing a system that manages itself at a certain, you turn it on and it goes. And sometimes that takes you out of the mind of the player, in that the player can't affect the system, but they do need to exist within the rules that all the systems offer them, such as not being able to jump and then fly forever. You fall with gravity. So one thing that I've been struggling with is remembering to get back in touch with the player's mechanics. So like one thing that I've been really excited about for a long time is, wouldn't it be really cool and an awesome extension of VR input if you could adjust your spells dynamically, just as you can adjust your dialogue options dynamically. And what that means is, so for dialogue options, you choose your tone, you can say it mean or nice, etc., etc. For spells, what if you could change like the radius or the damage amount relative to something else? Of course, to make spells not OP, you have to trade off something, whether it's more mana cost or something like that, I don't know. But there has to be a trade-off there. But I was so excited by the idea of dynamic editing. Of just like, well, why? other than for its own sake, would you want to change a spell? And if you do change a spell, it should fundamentally alter its interaction with the system, or else it's pointless. Like, if all you're doing is changing the radius of the spell to be bigger and hit more things all at the same time, yeah, that's nice, but it's not really fundamentally altering the way you're interacting with the system. In fact, it's kind of game breaking, and then it sort of bends the rules of a system, and that one of the systems being, you have to hit the enemies. You have to aim pretty close to the enemies to hit them. So if one of the kind of augmentations or editable properties of a spell is radius, then it kind of, I think, removes that as a consistent rule for the player. And it kind of forces the player to sacrifice, what might be naturally appealing to them, based on an alternative standard, such as kind of spell best value spell. Basically, you're turning the player into a bargain hunter when you expose mechanics that bend the rules. And there's a lot of aspects to bargain hunting for lots of games. It's really common in lots of RPG games where you're kind of trying to figure out how you can have the most damage, or or have the most fun, or have the least amount of like running or effort to different aspects. Like, you're looking for different areas to be very, very efficient at. You want to maximize, your power or strength or something. Usually in an RPG game, and there's usually a specific way to accomplish that. A lot of games try to, make it trade-offs where you can only get this or this, but at the end of the day, the math still comes to how much damage did you do, how much damage did they do to you, how difficult is the dodge. At some point, the math comes out, and so you're striving to come at some sort of correct answer. And when you expose mechanics that directly mess with kind of the final result, that is a challenge to deal with as a player. It almost makes you feel like you can't pick what's most appealing. You have to test and go with what's most effective. And once again, I can respect that, but what I'm getting at here is it's the thing for the sake of itself. For example, some character, some people that like to play RPGs play it for, the crit chance or the crazy, one-shot damage or burst damage. But in a lot of cases, it's a huge trade-off. You have to plan very carefully, or you're very easy to kill otherwise, or you have long cooldowns or something like that. And so it's a very tight system in that you're able to make something overpowered because you give up certain things. Now, the degree to which you can, on the fly, make adjustments and basically reverse trade-offs is the degree to which you you're giving players all the rewards of high risk outcomes, or high reward outcomes, and you're minimizing the risks. So, for example, balanced fighters tend to be the noob route that is encouraged for people who are less experienced or less skilled at the fighter mechanics, because you're got some of everything, and you don't have any hugely glaring weaknesses, and so you can succeed or do fairly well in the game. But even that's a trade-off. Your trade-off is that you don't get the crazy damage, and maybe you don't get the crazy tankiness, or tankiness is more of a safe stat. So maybe you do, but you don't get maybe the shorter cooldowns or something. You don't get something for a balanced play. You just get, I guess, a little less of everything at its greatest extreme. So I guess where I'm going with that is, if spells can be altered in a fundamental way, how is any spellcasting choice or rule set meaningful if it's alterable? And that is really tricky. It's ditto syndrome in that, the more options you have, the less important all your options, and to a certain degree, there's always going to be a top favorites list. So how many combinations until you find your favorite? And it's not just a favorite, it's just like a superior. Maybe you have the worst thing to me in a game is when I really enjoy a mechanic, but it feels so much weaker than other mechanics which are more boring that I feel like it can't pursue the things that are interesting to me. So I guess maybe that's what struck me, is that I'm like, oh, adjusting a spell is very cool. Like, you activate sort of like a overlay on your arm for casting, and a bunch of meters kind of pop up, and while you're holding that down, you can twist your arm or push it forward and backward, and it'll edit the spell. But why is that meaningful? And in many conversations it comes back to, okay, well, it depends a lot on the enemies. What kind of enemies do you need to strategically outdo? Is it a bunch of horde enemies, which is just difficult to deal with, so you have to efficiently do as much damage? You got to up your DPS for every mana point that you use, because you can run out of mana relatively easily, and so you have to make sure you're using your damage effectively. Or is it more of a PvP aspect where, okay, really what you're trying to do is just anticipate your opponent's moves and counter what they're trying to do, and it's less about mana efficiency and more about tactical awareness and figuring out and countering their moves. So I don't know, it's quite a challenge, and I've been back and forth with a lot of systems. One of my most recent approaches was like, well, so many games that use spells or guns, the primary skill input, I guess, or skilled mechanic is just aiming, aiming and hiding. The hiding, especially in VR, being a less exciting, less easy to develop for mechanic, because you're fairly limited in your play area. So even if you were perfectly in the middle of the room, it's not very comfortable to move around very fast, especially with extra headgear and weights in your hands. The dodge aspect does not feel very good, and with limited peripherals, you don't get the sense of your body very well either. I felt in many games when there's enemy projectiles coming towards me that my ability to consistently dodge or know where my hitbox is as a body is pretty bad. It doesn't feel very good, and it's a lot. And the worst thing is, it's a huge workout, and it might not pay off. Like you can really dash or sidestep really quickly to the side of the room, and that's once again if you're in the middle. If you're not in the middle, then you will likely brush up against stuff, and that is not fun either. So that presents a challenge within VR as well, just the hiding aspect, like ducking. I would say the visual experience of being close to objects and hiding, like the stealth aspect from a cinematic perspective of moving your head around things slowly, is very enjoyable, but the mechanical dodge or blocking mechanics are very difficult and frustrating. A part of that might even be that it kind of feels unfair because you're used to games your entire life being basically giving you the cheat code of I can look around without, like the third person look around, I can look around without risking being headshot or something like, or hurt. I have a kind of a partially omniscient vantage point in that, I can look around corners and stuff without actually moving my character to that point. But you can't do that in VR, or at least most games don't recognize that because it's fully first person, almost all games, and so your hitbox is the most hitbox that you have is your head. Everything else is kind of guessed at, and the hands don't really make very good hitboxes. So hiding, maybe surprisingly at first glance, doesn't feel like a very effective skill option. And I would apply that reflection to first-person shooters, like you're bunny hopping around and you're moving your stick back and forth. It's very minimal effort for maximum dodge and confusion for enemy players. Doing all those things does not require much effort and will make it way harder for them to hit you. And so, whether that's a conscious design strategy or not, that ends up being a huge part of the skill, is doing that effectively while simultaneously trying to aim at them. So one of my more recent focuses has been, aiming as a mechanic, at least in how it's executed from my point of view, is kind of bad, which is frustrating because in VR you have one of the most accurate aiming tool sets, which is a controller that's tracked really, really well for once in an environment in which your head can visually understand its relationship. You can actually have hand-eye coordination in a direct way in VR that you could never have before, because you have to completely recreate the gun in a completely different perspective and understanding, as far as you look down and you see it. So VR has the highest capability for understanding where you're aiming, but there's a couple problems with that when I started thinking about it as a skill, as a primary skill factor. Primary skill factor for a spellcasting game is there's not a lot of intellectual aspect. It's kind of more physicality to aim a controller, and maybe either hold it steady or make very, very slight rotations or movements side to side to aim things very particularly. Does not feel like a great intellectual or mental challenge to me. So a comparison I might make is with a game like League of Legends. Your aim, it's not difficult to aim where you want to aim. As far as positionally, I would make the argument that in first-person shooters, aiming where you want to aim, you're somewhat limited by the analog stick, its acceleration and movement speed and stuff like that. But mice are very, very sensitive and programmable way past the degree that analog sticks are. I know there's sensitivity, but even with that taken into account, you have way more control and consistency over placing your kind of crosshairs in a sense. And so a lot of the strategy is not on where you place your spells, though in split seconds placing it in the right place is important. A lot of the skill is on prediction of where the enemy is going and putting the right spells there and anticipating counter moves and stuff like that. It's really not, can you consistently hit them? In fact, within League of Legends, there's something called auto attack, where all champions, if you right click within the correct range per champion, it will literally just do damage as a strategic, almost turn-based system, which is a really interesting aspect, that there's a portion of it that's specifically not skill shot based. There's a specific component of League of Legends that's okay, this is not about aiming. this is a purely strategical move. Is it correct to put it to auto attack here? Is it not correct? I think that's really fascinating, and I find a lot of that very mentally challenging as far as, calculating whether it's the right or wrong time to do that. And so I want to explore that idea and try, though it's very tempting and relatively easy to add in a lot of skill, or weight the skill factor very heavily in favor of aiming, especially in VR where your aiming can be the best and most satisfying in a sense. One of the limitations of VR aiming is that your resolution is way worse. So since the most skilled aiming happens when the enemy is far away, low resolution makes that actually very unsatisfying. So in a sense, your aiming with VR is most satisfying in a medium range where you're only changing your aim within basically one peripheral. So what your limited view angle is from a VR headset, I would say the most satisfying aiming is, aiming your right hand from an enemy right at the or not right at the edge, but closer to the right side, and then switching to the left side would be a very satisfying thing. But beyond that, less satisfying because you have limited peripherals and resolution. And then, of course, the farther away the enemy gets, the less satisfying it is because you don't get to see the effects as much. And in general, aiming requires higher resolution. Otherwise, it's it doesn't feel good, and it's not easy to do. And also, because of how rotation works, a small rotation at the base leads to an increasingly large difference as far as aiming at one thing and aiming at a slightly different thing. The rotation between them, the rotation that you make with your hands or with the hand controller, has a massively greater impact on the different kind of target explode area the farther away it gets from you. So similar to with a sniper rifle, if someone's right in front of you, you have to move the stick a lot, whereas someone is really, really, really far away, but they're still, even if they're sprinting, you have to move the analog stick or whatever you are, the mouse, a really, really tiny amount. Just because it's, when you're rotating, you've got an angle going, so it just, the farther away they are, the more fine-tuned your rotations have to be. So that's another thing with VR is that, and I'm very prone to shaky hands. I do not have steady hands at all for something like that, where my arm is just supported by itself and it's not braced against anything. It's not a very steady thing. So that's frustrating, and I think could potentially be very much a false idol to seek out in the realm of VR is long range aiming. I think is not satisfying and difficult to become highly skilled at, and preys on some of the biggest weaknesses of VR, or suffers from it, I should say. So what am I trying to do in response or as an alternative? Well, one idea I had is kind of secondary guidance spell casting, where you would shoot a spell, and then if you wanted to hold on to control of the spell, you could redirect it kind of halfway. You could change the trajectory, not in a overtime guided sense, but in a redirect. So kind of you shoot it off to the right, and then you maintain capture of it, and then you kind of thrust it to the left, and it will kind of like an airplane, kind of bank to the left and explode there. So that was one aspect that I thought might be fun and introduce a more strategic element, but that's also kind of exhausting. I mean, so I don't know. It's very difficult, but that's something that I'm working on right now. Is what what is a great way to use the really enjoyable and complex input of VR controllers, which is kind of a 3D plus axes or degrees of input. You know, you've got movement, forward, backward, left, right, up, down, and then also rotation. Both twisting and forward and backward, but really the twisting, I think, is the most usable or user-friendly degree. But you've got so many degrees of input relative to like an analog stick, which is just X and Y. So you can do a lot of really cool things with manipulating what you're telling the game. But what's a meaningful, effective way, you know, like what would be the skillful factor in a great battle between spellcasters and mages? Would it be the aiming? I mean, there's the predictive aiming, which, you know, gets closer to League of Legends. I mean, obviously there's leading in all gun games where you have to shoot ahead of the person, or not all, but many gun games where you have to shoot ahead of the person if they're running and they're a certain distance away. But it's not nearly as chaotic as aiming in something like League of Legends, where people can teleport. Everyone has a free teleport every couple of minutes, and what else? And half of the champions, if not more, have some sort of like dashy thing or invincibility, and they have items to move also, or go really fast, or block spells. So there's a lot more variability there. So there's the predictive aspect of definitely a skillful part of casting, but as far as the shooting the projectile, you know, as I said, I did a lot of research into adjusting the AoE or the range or the number of projectiles or the damage, and I thought it was a really fascinating system, but I'm not exactly sure what would make that meaningful or whether that's the correct way to go. But yeah, thanks for listening, and check in again next time.